Welcome to the first in a series of presentations on the Urban Competency Framework. This presentation is an introduction to the Urban Competency Framework, which was developed by RedR UK with funding provided to the International Rescue Committee from ECHO. The Urban Competency Framework and accompanying research report and user guide are part of a wider project for the Global Alliance for Urban Crises entitled Developing the Skills to Meet the Needs of Urban Populations in Crises through the Alliance of Urban Responders. This presentation provides an introduction to the Urban Competency Framework and covers three main areas: what the Urban Competency Framework is, why it was developed, and how it was written. We'll start by looking at what the Urban Competency Framework is. The Urban Competency Framework describes the competencies and behaviours that people need in order to work effectively in urban crises. The framework has been created with the intention that these competencies will apply to all of those working in urban crises, including those who consider themselves to be primarily humanitarians, those who consider themselves to be professionals from other fields applying their expertise in a humanitarian context, as well as volunteers or community members who may themselves have been affected by the crisis. The competencies apply to employees, roster staff, and volunteers working for a wide range of organisations, including international and national NGOs, faith-based and civil society organisations, private sector organisations and professionals, as well as local and national authorities. The framework outlines the core competencies that are required in urban crises. This includes contextual competencies that arise from the specific nature of the urban context, as well as humanitarian competencies adapted to urban contexts. These competencies are distinctly important for urban crises. However, this doesn't mean they are unique to these contexts, and those working in other humanitarian contexts may require some of these competencies to a greater or lesser extent. It is also important to note that individuals working in urban crises will also require other competencies that relate to their specific role. For example, if they are managing projects or budgets, they will need competencies that are appropriate to these functions. If they are working as a wash engineer, they will need appropriate water and sanitation competencies. These competencies are essential, but they are defined by the specific role, and so they are not included in the framework. In the next part of the presentation, we're going to move on to look at why the Urban Competency Framework was written and what purpose it is hoped that it will serve. It is widely documented that the scale, impact and frequency of urban crises are increasing, and because the number and proportion of the world's population are living in cities, the impact of these crises will only continue to increase. Many of the tools and approaches that are used in humanitarian situations were initially developed for rural crises, but agencies are increasingly finding that these are not appropriate in urban contexts, or that they are not as effective as they could be. This is partly about the number of people that are affected in urban crises, as well as the nature of urban environments that affect and define the crisis and impact the appropriate response. There are significant differences between cities, between different neighbourhoods, within cities, and between urban and peri-urban areas. Despite this, there are characteristics that urban areas share. While it is difficult to define urban or what a city is, it is possible to define these characteristics. Rather than crafting a definition, ALNAP has identified 8 characteristics that urban areas share. These are defined municipal administrative boundaries, complex interdependent social pressures, diverse livelihoods and income opportunities, higher proportion of built-up area, cash-based economy, a presence of essential services and infrastructure, concentration of administration structures such as government and hospitals, and high population densities. These characteristics shape, exacerbate, and catalyse crises. They affect how the crisis impacts people, the ways in which they are vulnerable and what types of risks they face. These characteristics also offer opportunities for adaptation and recovery. Tools and approaches that are designed for rural crises aren't necessarily appropriate for urban crises, as they weren't designed with these characteristics, risks, and opportunities in mind. A full categorisation of urban crises hasn't been created, but the University College London have undertaken research into trends in urban crises. Having studied urban crises over the last 2 decades, they've identified 6 broad types of urban crises and described how the characteristics of urban contexts shape these urban crises. The first is in areas that have been poorly planned with urban growth poorly managed. In these contexts, high population densities found in urban areas result in an increased risk of disease, epidemics, violence, and displacement. In this type of crisis, an initial emergency, such as an earthquake, may quickly give rise to a further crisis, such as a cholera outbreak or civil unrest. The second type is urban areas affected by forced displacement. Sudden influxes of people into an urban area, perhaps fleeing a crisis elsewhere, can create an urban emergency. A large proportion of these people are likely to move into informal settlements, which are likely to already be overcrowded and have limited access to services and few income-generating opportunities. This overcrowding and lack of access to basic needs can create an urban crisis in itself. In addition, in urban areas that are affected by disasters and climate change, conflict and violence, complex emergencies, and chronic poverty and insecurity, the impact of emergencies can be increased by the characteristics and nature of the urban environment. In all these cases, overcrowding and high population density, limited or poorly planned population growth, limited access to services and opportunities for income generation can all exacerbate the impact of crises on people who are already vulnerable and are less resilient to shocks. The Urban Competency Framework is an attempt to define the most effective ways of working in these types of urban crises. In urban crises, it's really important to seek to understand the context, both of urban crises in general and of the specific urban crisis. It's important to work collaboratively and to actively reach out to a wide range of diverse stakeholders, to understand the complex systems that are at play in governance, services and infrastructure, and to analyse the ways in which people are vulnerable in these contexts. Humanitarian aid needs to shift away from an approach of providing aid to beneficiaries and seek to work in a way that supports and facilitates the recovery of people, communities, services, governance structure, businesses, and so on. Individuals need to work flexibly and be able to adapt to dynamic and fast-moving situations in which they may not have access to all the information they require. Finally, they also need to be competent in negotiation and influencing people to encourage the wide number of stakeholders to work together effectively. In the final part of this presentation, we're going to look at how the Urban Competency Framework was written. There were 7 stages in the development of the framework. The first stage was the writing of a research report which analysed what makes urban contexts unique and which identified an initial list of knowledge, skills, attitudes and competencies that were considered to be important in urban crises. The learning from the research report was combined and developed into a framework. There were 4 stages in the drafting process, with each draft of the framework being shared for review and feedback in a combination of remote and face-to-face consultations, before the framework was finally signed off by the Global Alliance for Urban Crises. The research and drafting process were informed by an analysis of a wide range of documents from a number of organisations as listed here. The research report and user guide both contain full bibliographies of the documents that were referred to. In addition to the documents, learning curricula from urban-focused courses were analysed. Courses from the following organisations were analysed: Disaster Ready, Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, Open University, Plan Academy, and RedR UK. The purpose of this analysis was to identify skills, knowledge, and competencies that these organisations considered to be important for urban crises. Finally, the research and drafting process took into account existing relevant competency frameworks. The frameworks listed here are some examples that were used. The purpose of looking at the competency frameworks was to establish an appropriate format for the Urban Competency Framework, as there is no standard format for competency frameworks, as well as to identify useful or overlapping content. These frameworks help to shape what would and would not be included in the Urban Competency Framework. This analysis also helped us to identify that there is no existing competency framework that defines the competencies required in urban crises. Thank you for listening to this presentation. Further information about the framework can be found in the user guide and research report and in the other presentations in this series. Thank you for listening.